Hello and welcome back to How to Art. So I have another time-lapse video for you today, and you've guessed it, it is another briefcase, but I figured this one you can sort of see more of my methods, and I'm going to show you the reason I put this one on there is it was the next frame that I needed to do, and also I was going to show you how I use an image, and although it seems like I'm tracing, the image actually looks very dissimilar afterwards. So at the minute I have a metal briefcase that I've had for nearly 20 years now, and it's a similar shape, and it's the only thing I could find that would sort of meet the criteria because it's sort of rectangular, or cuboid I should say. And it's also good for the hand sort of positioning. So what I've done is I've started tracing it, and as I'm tracing it gets the hand sort of points there. You'll also notice as well that I've put in the previous briefcase in, and that's because I recycle a fair amount, and it also means that I can sort of make sure it looks the same, like things. It's basically a reference there so that I can change the metal briefcase that I've taken a picture of to look like the leather briefcase that I use in my comic. So at the minute I'm sort of freehand drawing the lines down, which I seem to really struggle with for some reason, and my hand seems to keep going awry, but you know, I sort of got the hang of it after a while, and so I'm going through that. As you can see, I'm really zoomed in to try and make sure it doesn't look too off. So as you can see, I'm sort of turning off and on the background image. It does look like a flash, and the reason I'm doing that is so that I can sort of see what it looks like, because obviously the reference image in the background does sort of distort it a bit, and it can make it a bit confusing. Now these corner bits I really struggled with, the little circular corner bits, and that's because the shape of my briefcase is actually a bit different, and it's also got these sort of things that stick out, so I had to really sort of look carefully for that as I was drawing it. You'll notice down here as well I'm sort of losing, because obviously the briefcase is at an angle, so that was another thing I struggled with, and getting the dimensions to be the same too. So here you'll notice that there's nothing there. I'm just sort of freehand drawing that, and that's where I'm going on about when I trace. I don't trace the image perfectly at all, I just use it as a reference to sort of map in. It's sort of like using a circle stencil if you want to start off drawing a circle in a way. So these parts here is what you can see on the briefcase, which you'll see from the previous video. It's sort of like almost like the stitching that holds it together, and that's what I'm trying to go for here. You'll notice it takes me a few attempts to get these corners right, and I really struggled with them. I tried copying and pasting it as well, but because obviously it's an angle and it's different sort of part of there, it didn't work, so I decided to sort of just best to freehand it again and sort of work with that, because one thing you want to make sure is when you're drawing, you want to draw everything the same way. And what I mean by that is that if you're drawing everything freehand, there's going to be slight sort of wonkiness to your lines, but the minute you start using straight lines in there, it's going to create a contrast. It's really going to sort of draw your eye in, and it's going to make the whole thing looking a bit odd. So you either use all straight lines and perfect mechanical lines, or you'd use none. Unless of course there's a very good reason, such as, I don't know, maybe trying to get your comic people to look in awe at something that's perfectly spherical or perfectly square or something. But generally you want to, it's a good rule to make sure everything is drawn the same. Now these sort of corner posts I actually struggled with a little bit, because it sort of maps round the briefcase and it's circular, but on the other briefcase it doesn't look like that, so I had to really sort of concentrate how I was sort of working with that. Also the lighting as well isn't great, because I have to sort of take the picture in my mirror. My mirror is quite thin, so I have to zoom in with my phone, which hasn't got the best camera in the world, so it's quite low quality, and as you can see it's quite pixelated, so again I have to sort of guess where things are going to go, and that's why I use reference images as well. Okay, for this part here I've decided that I was going to sort of draw the middle bit, the actual sort of opening of the briefcase. yeah, it's quite tricky sort of just rubbing that out. I had to pause it to have a quick look at some as well because I was struggling to find the right sort of what a crease in the briefcase looks like. So my original aim was I was going to draw it like so it had two edges to it, so it was a bit more three-dimensional rather than a solid black line. But I found that was too difficult, and you'll see in a second the line looks too awry, and that was a bit like And as you can see, like trying to get that consistency, because it's quite down there, it just completely turns invisible. Yet up there, it's a lot more defined. It's a lot darker. So when I got to about here, I sort of drew that across, and I thought, it's probably not. It doesn't look right. So I decided to get a big thick line like this, and you'll see how I sort of adapt that in a second. But this incorporates the shading and everything, and it's a comic as well, so you're going to have these big thick lines in there. But I was happy with using a big thicker line there. You'll notice now I've zoomed out as I sort of draw a lot of the lines. I'll show you, it will show you in a second. So this one, you notice I've sort of zoomed out. And the reason I zoomed out, I found that by drawing with my shoulder, I was actually able to get straighter lines than when I was really zooming in and trying to get the proportions right. Because you're drawing from your shoulder, and for some reason when you draw from your shoulder, you actually get more sort of, how do I describe it? Better sort of dimensions, better sort of normal shapes and lines, as opposed to when you're drawing from your wrist and your hand, because your hands doesn't quite move in straight lines very well, whereas shoulders do, because it's a lot more circular sort of joint. So as you can see, just by it seems quicker as well, and just by zooming out, it looks better than the other lines. I decided to keep the other ones because they're alright as well. Yeah. So I was trying to get the corner bits there as well. That was quite tricky, trying to make sure that they looked symmetrical, because they're going to be the same size on either side, because obviously you're stitching down the stitching of your leather briefcase. Yeah, so as you can see, it's going a lot faster. I'm sort of drawing from there. Obviously I wanted the corner flaps to overlap. They're the ones that are stitching things down, so I rub out the lines in between just to make sure that it's got that consistent look about it. So I had to eyeball that little corner bit there. This bit was quite tricky because I had no reference, so I sort of had to guess whereabouts it was going, and I'd just check it off as well by closing the background just to make sure it's okay. I noticed that there was the little sort of stands for the briefcase underneath, like shark's tooth shape. I made the one on one side a bit smaller because obviously that perspective is a little bit further away. In hindsight, I'm not as happy with that as I would be if I'd ever concentrated a bit more. So for the metal clips as well, a leather briefcase doesn't have metallic clips. It will have something a bit more like a latch. So that's what I sort of tried to go for there. The latch is obviously going to be on top because it's holding the briefcase together, so the crease underneath, you're not going to see that. So that's why I've made it as it is. It had to sort of try and go with sort of the diagonals because it is obviously at that angle as well. I noticed it still wasn't quite 100% now looking back, which is annoying. Well, you know what they say, hindsight has 20/20 vision. Another thing I would always recommend, name your layers, because on some of my layers I've got over 100 layers. You know, when you're doing like little bits, you're going to have 5 layers for one little item in your background. And you can't call all of them shadow, you can't call all of them outline, so try and be as specific as you can. I tend to group things now as well. So this bit here, I've used the magic wand to select the outside of the layer, gone to the layer below, inversed it and then coloured it in. Now this leather briefcase texture I actually lost, so I had to redo, and you'll notice it's lighter than the other one. so I had to sort of relearn how to do it, and I'll change it in a minute. Now I was going to just rub out certain parts, but I figured that was slower and also not great practice. So what a good rule of thumb is to use masks, which I'll show you in a second. But what I've done here is I'm just selecting where it wouldn't be. I pressed delete, then realised it wasn't quite right, because erasing's okay, but if you make a mistake, especially with textures, it can be a real bugger to sort of redo. So what I did was I applied a mask, and that way you can sort of go back and forth with it. So if you use white, if it's coloured in white, then the pattern will show. If it's coloured in black, the pattern will not show. So I'm just trying to sort of map these bits, and you'll see I've overlapped it a little bit. Now if I was using a rubber, I wouldn't be able to redeem that without undoing the whole thing. So what you can do is you can just sort of change colours and rub it back over, and then I made a mistake, and you sort of go over, and it just gives you, it's just better practice. So I would recommend using masks unless you know for definite that you don't want something somewhere. So I've realised as well I made a mistake, so this is another reason. If I'd have deleted that before, I'd have had to have coloured all this in again, because if I apply a new texture, it might not necessarily map to the coordinates of that part of the image if it's already mapped on something before. So I could simply just colour it in white and boom. I used the patch tool there because I did actually make a mistake and deleted it from the original image. The patch tool is quite good. That basically copies whatever's on somewhere else on the picture, and you can just change it. So here I've used a multiply black tool just to sort of darken it so it looks more like the briefcase that I had. I also found the colours were not quite right, and that's because whenever I was colouring it in, the dark and shadow thing was there, so I sort of merged that just to permanently darken the colour of that. So now I was starting on the skin tone, and as you can see I went to my palette for that, and I'm just using the pen tool now to colour that in. And if you've got multiple sort of things you're colouring in, what you can do is you can do it on the map underneath, and it will sort of apply that colour to that without overlapping onto the drawing, so you can be a bit sloppy. It's just a little way to sort of speed things up. Now I'm using my burn tool, my favourite tool, just to sort of darken where the sort of flaps are overlapping. I've done a bit where his hand is as well, because obviously there's not going to be much light there. I sort of applied that reference of my photo as well, just so I know where certain things are. Added a bit to that, and as you can see now, just by doing that, it's really starting to bring it together now. And the briefcase bit's done, so now I'm starting to work on the concrete, because obviously you don't want a background there. The thing that I wasn't too happy with is I realised after I started doing the concrete texture is that unless I had things at the end, it wouldn't look right. And so in the end I actually made the whole thing the same texture, because I tried putting a blue background there, but it just looks like you're falling off the edge of a cliff. So I sort of mapped that out so it was the same thing. Now a little trick you can do with patterns as well is that if you do a free transform and change it, sort of like a trapezium shape, it sort of does the perspective for you. And then finally I just added in some shading for the crevices and some shadows as well for it, lowering the opacity. And then just darkening that side with a bit of the hand there, and we're done.